It'll be easier for us to talk about the takeaways after we get through this hiring cycle. There are 5 jobs that are open, and we'll see who winds up getting the jobs, what their backgrounds are, and everything else. The thing that happens every year when coaching jobs come around is we effectively wind up having the same discussion every single year about it because the problem is the same every single year about it. But rarely do the individual details matter that much. It's a big, grand, macro tracking issue that gets us to where we are with the lack of coaches of color in the NFL, which is better, I think, now than it was maybe 3 years ago, probably not as good as it was about 15 years ago. It's only going to change as much as the owners of the franchises actually wanted to change, and if they recognize this as a macro level problem. They did recognize that 20 years ago. I don't think they recognize it as much now, but I think they recognize it more than they did 5 or 6 years ago.
But it's a vicious circle, right?
On CNN, Bomani Jones laid it out. This came after this move.
Tracking breaking news out of the NFL after just one season, Lovie Smith is out as head coach of the Texans.
Which many NFL fans, myself included, rolled their eyes to.
The Houston Texans organization are an atrocity. They are an embarrassment. And as far as I'm concerned, if you're an African American and you aspire to be a head coach in the National Football League, there's 31 teams you should hope for.
Stephen A. Smith had this to say, which Bomani Jones rebuked.
Like, the thing about it is, I'm not exactly sure who should take that job. Where he says no black person should take that job. I wouldn't recommend no white man take that job either.
Here's what we know. The Houston Texans' previous owner, Bob McNair, said this of black players taking a knee.
The owner of the Houston Texans is apologizing after his comments about the ongoing protests of NFL players. Bob McNair said if the league didn't stop the protests, it would be like, quote, inmates running the prison.
And he also said this in a meeting with his fellow NFL owners and protesting players.
Lurie says, we can do more for the black community than you can ever imagine with our resources. Bob McNair then says, yeah, just make sure you tell your comrades to stop that protesting business.
When Dwayne Brown, a Texans lifer of 10 years since the day he came out of college from Virginia Tech, took exception to the inmate's comment, coupled with a contract dispute, McNair traded him to the Seahawks. He is still in the league with the New York Jets. The Houston Chronicle found Bob McNair donated the max amount to the 45th president of the United States, Donald Trump. He would pass in November of 2018, but his son Cal would take over. At a charity golf event in October of 2021, a pair of witnesses told Bally Sports' Michael Silver that Cal McNair told the crowd, I'm sorry that we couldn't get together last year because of the China virus. If this sounds familiar.
I would like to begin by announcing some important developments in our war against the Chinese virus.
This is why. So Cal would apologize for his anti-Asian bigoted comments, saying he would never want to offend anyone. It is fair to question if he would issue such a statement without the reporting coming to light. Cal would also hire, then fire, Jack Easterby, who Texans legend Andre Johnson despised and said the organization was notorious for wasting players' careers. Jack undermined other executives and fostered a culture of distrust within the franchise, which brings us to this man, David Culley, hired in 2021 as the Texans' first full-time head coach of color, something this guy, Jerry Jones, cannot say of his franchise. Now, if one remembers Josh McCown, a man who played quarterback in the NFL and had zero coaching experience outside of high school, was in the running for the job. So Culley was hired, then fired after one season, setting him up for failure with a roster that was reeling from Deshaun Watson and without J.J. Watt. GM Nick Caserio gave Culley a shrewd roster. At the time, the NFL only had one black coach remaining, that being Mike Tomlin of the Pittsburgh Steelers on February 1st of 2021.
Brian Flores, the former Miami Dolphins head coach, and his attorneys filed a lawsuit today in a court in Manhattan that alleges racism in hiring from the New York Giants, the Miami Dolphins, the Denver Broncos, and the National Football League.
Days later, the Houston Texans hired Lovie Smith, who admittedly said he didn't even know he was a finalist for the job.
This was all about the lawsuit. Congratulations to those guys. But this was about the lawsuit and being able to show, how you going to take this to court, Skip? We just hired a minority. That replaced a minority.
Brian Flores' lawyers agreed with Shannon Sharpe's assertion. Nick Caserio refuted the claim. Nonetheless, we are back at square one. Two black head coaches being given a single year with a roster that started Davis Mills, Kyle Allen, and Jeff Driscoll, which has created a domino effect within the NFL, especially with DeMeco Ryans, the defensive coordinator for the San Francisco 49ers. The former Texans linebacker who once filed a lawsuit against the team and league seeking damages and alleging issues with the field, surfaces, design, and construction after suffering a torn Achilles at NRG Stadium on November the 2nd, 2014, isn't expected to welcome the opportunity with Houston. Bomani Jones would conclude with this on NFL owners.
I say all that to say, unless somebody's going to take them to court, I don't feel like they'll be truly dedicated to fixing the problem. But I do think that right now, when you look at the ranks, it does look better than it did just a couple of years ago when it was only 2 coaches ago.
And now it's only 6 minority coaches.
Yes.
And one of them's an interim coach of the Panthers. What would you do? What would you do instead if the Rooney Rule is not working?
But the Rooney Rule, it's not the Rooney Rule that's not working.
Well, you talked about the owners.
People.
And to that, I say I partially agree, only because we have now seen different instances of coaches saying that they knew or learned that they were being interviewed to basically fulfill the quota of a requirement that is the Rooney Rule, where a team must interview a minority candidate for a coaching position, obviously including the head coaching position. We saw this with Marvin Lewis going on the record when he went on ESPN about the Carolina Panthers job. And we saw this when Brian Flores had an interview scheduled with the New York Giants. Bill Belichick accidentally, allegedly, texts the wrong Brian Flores instead of Brian Daboll, days prior to Flores' interview, saying congratulations on the job. So to that I say, I partially agree with Bomani.